She welded a metal box on top of her chimney pipe, and her neighbor told her she'd burn her cabin down by Christmas. Nobody would waste good timber digging her grave in frozen ground, he said. She had 2 children, $11, and 9 weeks before the first freeze. In January, the temperature hit 47 below zero. The mercury froze in the glass. But 7 months earlier, Karin Lindgren had never cut a cord of firewood in her life. Her husband Eric had handled the wood. He'd handled most things that required strength or danger, or venturing more than shouting distance from their cabin. Karin cooked, mended, tended the children, kept the accounts in a small leather notebook she'd brought from Minnesota. Eric felled trees, split logs, hunted elk when the larder ran low, rode 11 miles to Grayling for supplies. They had divided the labor of survival the way most homesteaders did, and for 14 months it had worked. Then a lodgepole pine kicked back while Eric was felling it, and the trunk caught him across the chest, and he lived for 3 hours while Karin held his hand and their children watched from the doorway. And then he didn't live anymore. She buried him on the northeast corner of their claim. The ground was soft in May, and she dug the grave herself because there was no one else to dig it. Her daughter Ingrid, 8 years old, helped drag stones from the creek bed to mark the plot. Her son Anders, 5, stood silent through the burial, clutching a wooden horse his father had carved him the previous Christmas. That night, after the children slept, Karin sat at the table with Eric's account book and tried to understand what she had left. Cash, $11.40. Livestock, 1 milk cow, 6 laying hens. Food stores, 40 pounds of flour, 15 pounds of beans, 8 pounds of salt pork, perhaps 60 pounds of potatoes in the root cellar. Firewood, 2 cords, cut by Eric before spring planting. Tools, a crosscut saw designed for 2 men, an axe, a hatchet, Eric's carpentry tools, and the land. 160 acres of Montana territory filed under the Homestead Act, 14 months into the 5-year proving up requirement. If she stayed, worked the land, made improvements, survived, the acres would be hers, free and clear. If she left, she forfeited everything. The 14 months already invested, Eric's grave, her children's inheritance. If she left, a man would file on her claim within the week. She did not sleep that night. She sat with the numbers until dawn grayed the window, and the numbers did not change, and she understood that the question was not whether she wanted to stay. The question was whether staying was possible. Silas Thornton arrived in late August, riding a dun mare that looked as weathered as he did. He was 58 years old, a former Army sergeant who'd homesteaded this country since 1879. He knew Montana winters the way a sailor knows storms, not theoretically, but in his bones, in the memories of friends who hadn't survived them. He'd come to assess the widow's situation. That's what he told himself. Really, he'd come to tell her what she already knew. Karin watched him walk her woodpile, counting under his breath. 2 cords and a quarter, maybe. Eric had been planning to cut more after harvest. Eric had been planning a lot of things. Thornton ran his hand along the stacked logs, checking the seasoning. Then he turned to face her, and his expression told her everything before he spoke. 10 cords minimum, he said. 12 to be safe. You've got 2. Karin nodded. She'd done the arithmetic herself, late at night, hoping she'd made an error somewhere. She hadn't. Thornton gestured toward the crosscut saw leaning against the cabin wall. That's a 2-man saw. Takes about 30 hours of hard labor to cut, buck, and split 1 cord, working alone with just an axe. You've got maybe 300 hours of cutting ahead of you. He squinted at the sky, calculating. First hard freeze comes in 9 weeks, maybe 10 if you're lucky. I can work 12 hours a day, Karin said. Knot and feed your children. Knot and patch that roof before the snow loads it. He pointed at her stovepipe where heat shimmered into the August air, barely visible against the blue sky. And even if you cut it all, that stove throws 70 cents of every dollar straight up the chimney. You could have 15 cords stacked to the eaves and still freeze if January comes in hard enough. Karin said nothing. There was nothing to say. Thornton's voice softened, but only slightly. Sell the cow. Sell the claim if you can find a buyer. Take your children to Helena before the passes close. He paused. Your husband is dead, Mrs. Lindgren. Don't make your children orphans by February. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Karin stood in the yard until he disappeared over the ridge, and then she stood there longer, watching the heat rise from her chimney pipe. 70 cents of every dollar, straight up into nothing. She started cutting wood the next morning, not because she had a plan, but because she couldn't think of anything else to do. The crosscut saw was useless alone, designed for two people working in rhythm, one pushing, one pulling. She tried it anyway and nearly dislocated her shoulder. The axe was better. She could fell small trees with the axe, buck them into rounds, split the rounds into burnable pieces. It was brutal work, it was slow, but it was something. By the end of the first week, she had added a quarter cord to her pile. At that pace, she would have 6.5 cords by first freeze, 3.5 short of minimum. Not enough to survive December, let alone January, but she kept cutting. What else could she do? Her hands blistered on the 3rd day. The blisters broke on the 5th day and bled through her gloves. By the 2nd week, the raw wounds had begun to callous, and she could grip the axe handle without gasping. Her shoulders ached so badly she slept sitting up because lying down meant facing the agony of rising again. Ingrid took over the cooking, 8 years old, standing on a stool to reach the stove, stirring beans while her mother swung an axe in the timber behind the cabin. Anders collected kindling, small branches he could carry in his arms, proud of his contribution, even though the kindling wouldn't last an hour in a January fire. 3 weeks in, Karin stopped to drink water and watched heat shimmer from her stovepipe. The pipe ran straight up from the stove, through the roof, into open sky. She could feel warmth radiating from the tin even standing 6 feet away. All that heat, rising, escaping, doing nothing useful before it vanished into the atmosphere. And she remembered. Her father, Gustaf Lindgren, had been a tinsmith in Lindström, Minnesota, a Swedish immigrant community where the old language still hung in the air and the old ways still mattered. He died of typhoid when Karin was 14, but she'd spent her childhood in his workshop, watching him bend sheet metal over forms, punch rivet holes, solder seams with a heavy iron, and a bar of silver-gray alloy. Metal wants to move, he used to tell her. You don't force it, you find where it wants to go. She remembered more than the craft. She remembered his stories. Her grandmother's house in Småland had a kakaloon, a Swedish tiled stove, tall and elegant, covered in hand-painted ceramic. Her father had described it so many times she could almost see it, the way it filled a corner of the room, the way the tiles stayed warm for hours after the fire died down, the way her grandmother would press her back against it on winter mornings and sigh with contentment. The magic of the kakaloon wasn't the tiles. The magic was inside where no one could see. The smoke doesn't go straight up, her father had explained. It goes through channels back and forth, bends in the brickwork that force the hot gases to travel farther before they escape. By the time the smoke reaches the chimney, most of the heat has been pulled out. Your grandmother could heat her house for 24 hours on a single firing, back and forth, back and forth. Karin stood in the August sun, watching her dollars rise and disappear, and the memory arrived like a key finding its lock. What if she could make the smoke work harder before it escaped? She couldn't build a kakaloon. That required tons of brick and tile, a mason's skills, months of construction. She didn't have the materials or the knowledge or the time, but she had sheet metal. She had her father's tools, hand snips, a ball-peen hammer, a punch, a soldering iron, a bar of solder. She'd kept them after his death, carried them to Montana, stored them in a chest she rarely opened because opening it meant remembering. She opened it now. What if she built a chamber, a box, that fit over the stovepipe? Inside the box, metal plates angled to force the smoke to zigzag before continuing up. More surface area for heat to radiate, more time for warmth to transfer into the room. The same principle as the kakelon, but in metal, smaller, something she could build with her own hands. The idea was simple. The risks were not. If she cooled the smoke too much, the draft would die. Smoke would back up into the cabin, choking her children in their sleep. If she cooled the smoke below a certain temperature, she didn't know exactly what temperature, but her father had mentioned it once. Tar would condense in the pipe. Creosote, the chimney fire fuel that had killed more homesteaders than blizzards. And every hour she spent on this device was an hour not cutting wood. If the device failed, those hours were gone forever. She'd enter winter even shorter than the mathematics already guaranteed. But the mathematics already guaranteed failure. Silas Thornton had said it plainly. She was going to be short, probably by 3 or 4 cords. The device was a gamble. Staying the course was a certainty. Karin Lindgren had never been good at certainties. Her nearest neighbor, Martha Crenshaw, rode over in early September with a gift, her late husband's bucksaw. Unlike the crosscut saw, a bucksaw could be operated by one person. It would help Karin cut faster. Martha was 45, a practical woman from Kansas who'd survived 8 Montana winters. She had opinions about most things, and she shared them freely whether asked or not. She saw the sheet metal laid out on Karin's workbench and frowned. "What's this for?" Karin explained. The kakeloon, the baffles, the zigzag. She used her hands to show how the smoke would be forced to travel farther, giving up its heat before escaping. Martha stared at the stovepipe, then at the metal, then at Karin. Her frown deepened. "You're going to trap hot smoke inside a wooden cabin, with 2 children sleeping 30 feet away." "I know the risk." "Do you?" "Because I've seen chimney fires take a house in 4 minutes. The whole thing, floor to roof, faster than you can carry a bucket from the well." Martha's voice softened slightly, but her eyes didn't. "Karin, your father was a tinsmith. You're a homesteader's widow. Those aren't the same thing. I watched him work for 14 years. Watching isn't doing." Martha left the bucksaw. She didn't offer to help with the metal. She didn't ask to see the design. She simply mounted her horse and rode away, leaving Karin alone with her father's tools and her grandmother's memory and the certain knowledge that everyone who knew her thought she was going to fail. Word traveled. In country this empty, word always traveled. Harlan Price arrived 2 weeks later. He owned the general store in Grayling and held paper on half the homesteads in the county, credit extended for seed and supplies, debts that accumulated interest and anxiety in equal measure. Eric Lindgren had owed him $45 at the time of his death. The debt remained unpaid. Price was not a cruel man exactly. He was a practical man, and practical men understood that sentiment had no place in business, and business was what kept the territory running. If a widow couldn't pay her debts, that was unfortunate. If her assets could be seized to satisfy those debts, that was simply how things worked. He found Karin behind her cabin, shaping a piece of sheet metal over a section of log she was using as a form. The metal was curved now, roughly cylindrical, about 10 inches across. "What in God's name is that?" Karin didn't look up. "A project." Price dismounted and walked closer, examining the workbench. He saw the baffles she'd already cut, rectangular pieces of metal with edges bent at angles and the rivets laid out in neat rows, and the soldering iron heating over a small fire. He laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. Mrs. Lindgren, I've lived in Montana 19 years. I've seen every fool idea a desperate sodbuster ever dreamed up. I've seen men try to heat their cabins with buffalo chips and burn their own floors doing it. I've seen a man pipe his stove through 3 walls trying to warm every room and set fire to his hay barn. He prodded the curved metal with his boot. This is the same thinking, desperate thinking. Karin set down her tools and stood. She was taller than Price remembered, or maybe she just held herself differently now. I don't recall asking your opinion, Mr. Price. No, but you do owe me $45, and I'm wondering whether I'll ever see it. He looked at her woodpile, 5 cords now, after 6 weeks of brutal labor, still well short of what she needed. You're behind on wood. You're ahead on crazy. That's not a combination that survives January. He mounted his horse, but didn't ride away immediately. He looked down at her from the saddle, and his voice carried across the yard. When you're ready to sell, come see me first. I'll give you fair price for the claim. Better than watching your children freeze while you play blacksmith. He rode away. Karin watched him go, then turned back to her workbench and picked up her tools. She had work to do. The device took shape over the following weeks, evolving through trial and error in the hours Karin could steal from woodcutting. The first design had baffles too close together. When she tested airflow by blowing through the chamber, she couldn't move air at all. She dismantled it and started over. The second design had a seam that split when she pressured it. The rivets hadn't been close enough together. The metal flexed and the salter cracked. She dismantled it and started over. The third design held. The specifications recorded in Karin's small notebook. Outer shell, 18 inches long, 10 inches in diameter. Built from a salvaged tin wash basin she'd cut apart and reshaped, supplemented with additional sheet metal. Inner passage, 6 inches in diameter, matching her stovepipe exactly. The smoke would flow through this channel, surrounded by the outer shell. Baffles, 4 internal plates of sheet metal, alternating left and right, angled at 30 degrees from horizontal. The smoke would hit the first baffle and be forced to turn. Then the second baffle would force it back. Then the third. Then the fourth. By the time the smoke exited, it would have traveled roughly 36 inches in an 18-inch space. Joints, riveted every 3/4 of an inch, seams sealed with solder applied by her father's iron. Total construction time, 41 hours spread across 5 weeks. 41 hours she hadn't spent cutting wood. October came with frost on the windows. Karin woke on the 15th to find ice crystals on the inside of the glass, water vapor from her family's breath, frozen in the night air. She could see her exhale cloud in the pre-dawn darkness. Outside, the thermometer read 18 degrees. Not dangerous, not yet. But a warning. She fired the stove for the first time since summer, feeding it kindling and split pine until the cast iron began to radiate warmth. Within an hour, she could feel the heat leaving through the pipe. The tin was almost too hot to touch where it passed through the roof. The device sat on her workbench, complete but untested. Tomorrow she would install it. Tonight, she would rest. She didn't rest. She lay awake calculating. Wood stockpile, 7.5 cords, better than she'd projected thanks to the bucksaw Martha had given her. Still 2.5 cords short of minimum. If the device worked, if it captured even 15 or 20% of the escaping heat, she might be able to stretch her wood supply further. The math might shift. If the device failed, if it killed the draft, or built up creosote, or cracked and leaked smoke into the cabin, she would be worse off than before. 41 hours of labor wasted, her children's lives endangered. She lay in the darkness and listened to Ingrid and Anders breathing in the next room, and she did not sleep until nearly dawn. Silas Thornton's wagon appeared on the morning of the installation. Karin saw him coming from a distance and felt her stomach tighten. She didn't want witnesses for this. She didn't want another lecture about the widow's folly, another practical man explaining why her desperate idea was doomed to fail. But Thornton didn't lecture. He climbed down from his wagon and began unloading wood, seasoned pine, cut the previous year, properly dried and ready to burn. 2 full cords. "Don't argue," he said before she could speak. "Your husband helped me raise my barn. I'm not going to watch his children freeze because I was too proud to carry a debt. I can't pay you for this." "Didn't ask for pay." He stacked the wood with efficient movements, log upon log, building her stockpile towards something that might actually be enough. "Asked you not to argue." When he finished, he walked to her workbench and examined the device. He didn't touch it. He studied it the way a man studies a piece of machinery he doesn't understand, looking for the logic, trying to trace the function. "This is for the stovepipe?" "Yes." "Your father's work?" "My work, his tools, his teaching." Thornton grunted. It was not approval exactly, but it was not dismissal either. He walked around the device, examining the seams, testing the weight with one hand. "It might work," he said finally. "Probably won't. Either way, you've got wood enough now to survive until March if you're careful." He paused at his wagon. "Don't burn your cabin down, Mrs. Lindgren. Your husband would haunt me." He drove away without looking back. Karin stood for a long moment, watching the dust settle behind his wagon. Then she turned to her workbench, lifted the device in both hands, and carried it inside. The installation took 2 hours. She had to remove a section of stovepipe first, working carefully with her father's snips to cut the tin cleanly. The existing pipe was blackened with soot. Years of smoke had left its residue, and she cleaned the cut edges with a rag before fitting the device into place. The chamber was heavier than the pipe it replaced. She secured it with sheet metal screws at the bottom and top connections, then wrapped wire around the joints for additional safety. If the device shifted, if it worked loose in the night, the consequences would be catastrophic. She checked every connection twice. Then she checked them again. The children watched from the doorway, silent. "Mama?" Anders said. "What is that?" "It's called a heat box," Karin said. She had no idea if that was the right name. She had no idea if there was a right name. "It's going to help keep us warm." "How?" Karin lifted her son onto her hip and pointed at the device. "You see those metal plates inside? When the smoke goes up, it has to go around them. Back and forth, like a snake. And while it's going back and forth, the heat comes out into our cabin instead of flying away." Anders considered this. "Snakes are cold," he said. "The snake will be warm, I promise." She built a small fire, not for warmth, but for testing. Kindling first, then a few split of pine. The flames caught and grew. Smoke rose from the fire into the pipe, into the device, and paused. Karin could see it through the gaps where the baffles met the chamber walls, the smoke hesitating, being forced to redirect, traveling sideways before finding the next upward path. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't hope. The smoke was moving exactly as she designed. The draft was weaker than before. She'd expected that. She opened the stove's air intake wider to compensate, letting more oxygen feed the flames. Within an hour, the outer shell of the device was warm to the touch. Not hot, she could rest her palm against it without pain, but warm. Heat that would have been 30 feet overhead, vanishing into the Montana sky, was now radiating into her cabin. "Is it working?" Ingrid asked from the doorway. Karin pressed her hand against the warm metal and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. We'll see, she said. We'll see. She kept records, scratched on a board with a pencil. October 23rd. Fire test. Device warm. Draft reduced but functional. Room temperature 58 degrees versus typical 52 degrees with same fire size. October 24th. Full day burn. Wood consumption approximately 15% less for same warmth. No smoke smell in cabin. October 25th. Check chimney top. Climbed onto roof in frost. Smoke exits warm, melt snow on contact. No creosote smell. Draft holds. The device was working, but the real test hadn't come. November brought steady cold, not the killing cold, not the cold that froze mercury and stopped hearts, but cold enough to matter. Karin burned her stove day and night, feeding it every few hours, watching her woodpile shrink. But the shrinking was slower than expected. Martha Crenshaw visited in late November, stepping into Karin's cabin and stopping short. It's warm in here. The stove is burning. Your stove is always burning. My stove is always burning. My cabin isn't this warm. Martha looked at the device mounted to the stovepipe, blackened now with use, radiating heat into the room. It's working? Actually working? So far. Martha walked closer, examining the baffles through the gaps, watching the smoke hesitate and turn. She didn't apologize for her earlier doubts. She didn't say she'd been wrong, but her voice was different when she spoke. What happens when it gets to 40 below? I don't know. Neither do I. That's what worries me. December brought the first taste of real cold. On the 14th, the temperature dropped to 28 below zero and stayed there for 5 days. Karin's fire burned hot and continuous. She checked the device every morning, looking for cracks, checking for creosote, making sure the draft still functioned. The draft held. The cabin temperature held. 48 degrees with a moderate fire. Cold by summer standards, but survivable by winter standards. She checked the chimney top and found light dusty buildup, the harmless first stage of creosote, nothing dangerous. The device was working at real cold, but 28 below was not 40 below, and 40 below was not 50 below. And somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, the real cold was gathering itself for the journey south. Christmas came. The children hung stockings. Karin had saved enough money, barely, to buy each child one small gift. A hair ribbon for Ingrid, a carved horse for Anders. The new horse looked nothing like the one Eric had made, but Anders clutched it anyway, sleeping with it pressed against his chest. They sang Swedish carols her mother had taught her. The fire burned low and steady. The device radiated warmth. Her woodpile stood at 8 cords. Thornton's gift had made the difference. At current burn rate, she had enough for 72 more days. Through late February, past the worst of winter, Martha Crenshaw stopped by with a jar of preserved plums. She looked at the device, at the woodpile, at the children playing by the fire. "You might make it," she said. Karin didn't answer. She was watching the sky through the window. The clouds had a color she didn't like, a greenish-gray bruise spreading along the western horizon. She'd seen that color once before, in her childhood, the day before a storm killed 30 head of cattle in her uncle's herd. "What is it?" Martha asked. "Nothing," Karin said. "Probably nothing." January 28th, 1887. Karin woke before dawn to a sound she didn't recognize, a low moan, almost musical, rising and falling in pitch. Wind, but not ordinary wind. This was wind with weight, wind with intention, wind that pressed against the cabin walls like something trying to get inside. She checked the thermometer nailed to the porch post. -41 degrees. She had never seen the mercury that low. She didn't know mercury could go that low. For a moment she wondered if the thermometer was broken, if the glass had cracked in the night, if she was misreading the scale. But the cold against her face when she opened the door told her the thermometer was working fine. She fed the stove. More wood than usual, the fire needed to be hotter, needed to fight harder against the cold pressing in from every gap and crack. The device glowed with captured heat, but the cabin temperature was only 42 degrees. She could see her breath. By noon, the wind had become a scream. The temperature had dropped to 47 below zero. Karin checked the thermometer again, certain she was wrong, but the thin red line sat exactly where she'd read it. 47 below zero, with wind gusting strong enough to shake the cabin walls. At 2 in the afternoon, the mercury stopped moving. It had frozen in the glass. Karin stared at the thermometer for a long moment, trying to understand what she was seeing. Mercury froze at 38 or 39 below zero. She remembered her father telling her that once, explaining why the thermometers in Sweden had been filled with alcohol instead. The mercury in her thermometer wasn't at 38 below, it was lower, and it was frozen solid. She didn't know what temperature it was outside. She couldn't know. Her only instrument for measuring cold had become a casualty of the cold itself. All she knew was that the world outside her cabin door had become something beyond measurement, beyond preparation, beyond anything she had planned for. And the storm was just beginning. The first night was the longest of her life. She fed the stove every 45 minutes, dragging herself from half sleep to shovel more wood into the firebox. She had never burned this much fuel, a quarter cord in a single 24-hour period, more than twice her normal rate. The device glowed with captured heat, but the cabin temperature hovered at 38 degrees. Water left in a cup froze solid by morning. The children slept together in one bed, buried under every blanket Karin owned. She checked on them every hour, pressing her hand against their foreheads, making sure they were warm enough to survive. In the firelight, she could see her own breath, inside her cabin, with the stove burning as hot as she dared. Outside, the wind never stopped. It came in waves, building to a shriek that rattled the windows, then falling to a moan that was somehow worse, a sound like something dying over and over again. By dawn of the second day, Karin had not slept more than 20 minutes at a stretch. Her eyes burned. Her hands trembled as she loaded the stove. The world had become very small. The fire, the wood, the children, the device that radiated heat into a cabin that was still too cold. She didn't know if the storm would last another hour or another week. She didn't know how much wood she had left. She didn't know if the device could keep working under the strain, if the metal would hold or crack or warp in the sustained heat. She only knew that she had to keep the fire burning. Everything else was beyond her control. On the morning of the third day, Anders wouldn't wake up. Karin shook his shoulder, gently at first, then harder. He mumbled but didn't open his eyes. She pressed her palm to his forehead and felt heat. Not the cold she'd feared, but heat burning against her skin. Fever. Her 5-year-old son had a fever in the middle of the worst storm in Montana history, with the nearest doctor 11 miles away through wind that would kill a horse in 10 minutes. She lifted him from the bed, and he was light in her arms. Had he always been this light? And his skin was flushed and dry, and when she carried him closer to the stove, he whimpered but didn't open his eyes. Anders, look at me. Nothing. Ingrid appeared at her elbow, her face white. Mama, what's wrong with him? He's sick. He has a fever. Is he going to die? Karin looked at her daughter, 8 years old, her father dead, her brother burning with fever, the storm howling outside, the temperature beyond measurement, and she had no words that weren't lies. I need you to help me, she said. Can you do that? Ingrid nodded. I need you to watch the fire. Keep it burning, but not too hot. You see this line on the stove? She pointed to a discoloration on the cast iron, a boundary she'd learned from months of careful observation. Keep the fire below that line. If it gets too hot, the chimney could crack. If it gets too cold, we won't be able to keep Anders warm. Do you understand? Yes, Mama. I'm going to take care of your brother. You take care of the fire. Karin carried Anders to her own bed, stripped off his nightshirt, and wrapped him against her bare skin under the blankets. Skin-to-skin contact. It was how her mother had treated fevers when Karin was young, letting the healthy body regulate the sick one's temperature, pulling heat away when it climbed too high. She had willow bark in her medicine chest. She boiled water, steeped the bark, let it cool until it was safe to drink. Anders swallowed a few spoonfuls before turning his head away. The storm screamed outside. Ingrid fed the fire. Karin held her son against her chest and felt his heart racing beneath her palm. She began to pray. It had been years since she'd prayed. She'd stopped when Eric died, stopped believing in a God who would take a man in spring and leave his family to face winter alone. But she prayed now, in Swedish, the words her mother had taught her, words that meant nothing and everything. Let him live. Let him live. Let him live. The woodpile was 30 feet from the cabin door. Karin had stacked it carefully in the fall, building a neat rectangular pile against the cabin's east wall, protected from the worst winds by the structure itself. She had measured the distance from door to pile, exactly 30 feet. 30 feet had never seemed far before. Now, with the storm in its fourth day and her inside supply down to 8 logs, 30 feet might as well be 30 miles. She stood at the window and tried to see the woodpile. She couldn't. The world outside was a white wall, snow moving not downward, but sideways, driven by wind that hadn't stopped in 96 hours. She could hear the wood, or thought she could, the logs shifting and settling under the weight of accumulating snow. 8 logs. At the rate she was burning, that was 18 hours of fire. After that, nothing. Anders's fever had broken during the night, willow bark and body heat and luck combining to pull him back from whatever edge he'd been approaching. He was sleeping now, actually sleeping, his breathing steady, his forehead merely warm instead of burning. Ingrid dozed in a chair by the stove, exhausted from 3 days of fire duty. Karin looked at her children, then looked at the window, then looked at the door. She found a rope in Eric's toolbox, 20 feet of hemp, fraying at the ends, and tied one end around her waist in a clumsy knot. The other end she tied to the iron leg of the stove, the heaviest fixed object in the cabin. Ingrid. Her daughter's eyes opened. I have to get more wood. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, don't come after me. Stay with Anders. Keep the fire burning as long as you can. Ingrid's face crumpled. Mama, 15 minutes. Promise me. I promise. Karin opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall of knives. She had thought she understood cold. She had lived through Minnesota winters as a girl, Montana winters as a woman. She had felt the bite of 20 below, the ache of 30 below, the dangerous numbness of the December storm that had already tested her device. This was different. This was cold as a physical force, cold as violence, cold that tore the breath from her lungs before she could inhale and turned the moisture in her eyes to ice before she could blink. The wind didn't blow against her. It moved through her, finding the gaps between her coat and her skin, stealing heat from her blood before her heart could pump it to her fingers. She couldn't see. The snow wasn't falling. It was horizontal, a white wall moving at 50 miles per hour, filling her eyes and nose and mouth with ice crystals that felt like ground glass. She tried to shield her face with her arm, but the wind found her anyway. Within seconds, The skin on her cheeks had gone numb. She dropped to her hands and knees. Standing was impossible. Walking was impossible. The wind would have thrown her sideways, sent her tumbling into the white blindness until she was lost forever. She would crawl 30 feet. She had measured it in the fall, pacing the distance from door to woodpile, thinking of nothing more than convenience. 30 feet to the woodpile, 30 feet back. A child could walk it in seconds on a summer day. Her daughter could skip it in 10 heartbeats. Now those 30 feet stretched ahead of her like 30 miles, invisible, unmarked, deadly. She began to crawl. The rope unspooled behind her as she moved, her lifeline to the cabin, to Ingrid, to Anders sleeping off his fever, to the fire that would die in 18 hours if she didn't return with fuel. She couldn't feel the rope in her frozen fingers anymore. She couldn't feel her fingers at all. But she could feel the tension at her waist, the hemp pulling slightly as it paid out, proof that she was still connected to something beyond this white nothing. She counted movements. One knee forward, then the other. One hand planted in the snow, then the other. The drifts were up to her elbows, and she was pushing through them more than crawling on top of them. Each movement required her to shove snow aside, compress it beneath her weight, fight for every inch of progress. 10 movements, 20, 30. Her hand hit wood, the woodpile. She had reached the woodpile. She fumbled at the logs, trying to pull them free from the drift that had half buried them. The snow had packed around the wood, frozen into a solid mass, and she had to dig with her forearms because her hands weren't working properly. The fingers bent when she told them to, but they didn't grip, didn't close, didn't obey. She got one log free, tucked it under her arm. The bark scraped against her coat, rough and real, something solid in a world that had dissolved into white chaos. Another log, then 2 more, clutched against her chest like children. 4 logs, 12 hours of fire. Not enough, but she couldn't carry more. Not while crawling, not with hands that had stopped responding to her commands. She turned and followed the rope back. The return was worse. The wind was in her face now, driving ice crystals into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. She ducked her head and crawled blind, trusting the rope to guide her, feeling her way through the snow with numb hands and bruised knees. The logs kept slipping. She'd lost one of them somewhere behind her, hadn't felt it fall, only noticed its absence when she tried to shift her grip. 3 logs now, 9 hours of fire. Not enough, but she couldn't go back for it. Going back meant dying. Halfway to the cabin, she stopped. She knew she shouldn't stop. Stopping in cold this deep was how people died. The body's desperate need for rest overriding the mind's knowledge that rest meant death. But her arms were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the remaining logs, and her lungs were burning from the cold air, and her legs had stopped working properly, and she just needed one moment, one single moment, just long enough to gather herself. She laid her head on the snow. It wasn't cold anymore. That was the strange thing. The snow felt almost warm against her cheek, soft, welcoming, like a pillow she'd been searching for her entire life. The wind had stopped hurting. The ice in her eyes had stopped stinging. Everything had stopped hurting, and she was so tired, and the snow was so soft, and maybe if she just closed her eyes for a moment, she knew what this was. Her father had described it once sitting by the stove in his workshop, telling her about a man he'd known in Sweden who had frozen to death 100 yards from his own door. The dying felt warm at the end, he'd said. The cold wrapped around you like comfort right before it killed you. The body stopped fighting and started surrendering, and the surrender felt like peace. Her body was shutting down. Her blood was retreating from her extremities, abandoning her hands and feet and face to protect her core, concentrating everything she had left around her heart and lungs. Soon it wouldn't be enough. Soon she would sleep here in the snow, 15 feet from her children, and in the spring someone would find her body and wonder why she'd stopped so close to safety. The rope tugged at her waist, a sharp pull, insistent, desperate. Ingrid, standing in the cabin doorway, 8 years old, pulling on the rope with both hands, hauling her mother back from the edge of death. Karin couldn't see her daughter through the white blindness, but she could feel the rope tightening, feel the direction of safety, feel something beyond herself demanding that she move, that she fight, that she refused to die in the snow while her children watched. She crawled. She didn't think anymore. She didn't count. She didn't feel. She just moved. One hand, one knee. One hand, one knee. Following the rope through the nothing, through the white, through the cold that had stopped being cold, trusting the pull at her waist more than she trusted her own dying body. Something solid hit her face. The door frame. The rough-hewn wood of the door frame. Real and solid and vertical. Proof that walls still existed, that shelter still existed, that she had not crawled forever into an infinite white void. Hands grabbed her coat, small hands strong with desperation, pulling her forward, pulling her inside. The door slammed behind her, and the wind stopped, and the world changed from white to gold, firelight, her fire still burning, still alive. She had made it. Somehow, impossibly, she had made it. Ingrid helped her to the stove. Karin couldn't stand. Her legs had stopped working entirely, and she had to lean on her daughter's shoulder, had to let an 8-year-old guide her across the cabin like an invalid. The 3 remaining logs spilled from her arms onto the floor. She didn't have the strength to pick them up. Her fingers were white and waxy, the color of old tallow, and when she held them near the heat of the stove, the pain that came was worse than anything she'd felt crawling through the snow. Not a clean pain, not a sharp pain, a deep, burning ache that seemed to come from inside her bones, spreading up through her hands and into her wrists as the blood began to flow back into frozen tissue. "Don't touch them," she gasped. "Don't rub them. Don't try to warm them fast." She'd seen frostbite before. A neighbor in Minnesota, years ago, who'd warmed his frozen feet too quickly by a hot fire and watched the skin slough off in sheets. The tissue had to thaw slowly, gently, or it would die. She sat by the stove for an hour, shaking, crying without tears, because her eyes were too dry to produce them. The 3 logs she'd retrieved sat in a pile by the door, joined now by the 4 she'd already had inside. 7 logs, 18 hours of fire. She'd gained nothing, had lost a log somewhere in the snow, had nearly died for no net gain at all. But she was alive. Her children were alive. And the storm was still screaming outside, which meant she would have to go out again. She made the second trip 4 hours later. The fire was burning low, and she couldn't afford to let it die. The device mounted to the stovepipe was glowing with captured heat, warping slightly under the sustained stress, but still functioning. Without it, she knew, the cabin temperature would have dropped another 10 degrees. Without it, Anders might not have survived his fever. Without it, she would have burned through her wood supply 2 days ago. She tied the rope tighter this time. She wrapped her hands in extra cloth before pulling on her gloves, trying to protect the damaged tissue from further injury. She told Ingrid to count to 600, 10 minutes, and if the rope stopped moving before she returned, to pull. The second trip was faster than the first. Her body had learned something from nearly dying, had adapted to the horror in some primitive way. She crawled harder, moved quicker, didn't let herself stop. She reached the woodpile in 7 minutes, loaded 5 logs, and crawled back in 8. 15 minutes total, 5 more logs, 15 more hours of fire. Her hands were bleeding through the cloth wrappings when she unwound them by the stove. The blisters had broken, and the raw flesh beneath wept clear fluid. She cleaned the wounds with boiled water, wrapped them again in fresh cloth, and watched the fire burn. 6 hours later, she went out again. She made 4 trips total over the next 2 days. Each time she tied the rope. Each time she crawled. Each time Ingrid stood ready at the door, counting seconds, prepared to pull if her mother stopped moving. The 3rd trip, she fell twice, caught her knee on a buried rock, lost her balance in a gust that seemed to come from nowhere. The 4th trip, she couldn't close her fingers at all. The joints had swollen overnight, and the skin had gone from white to mottled purple where the frostbite was deepest. She had to hook her forearms around the logs and drag them back like a wounded animal carrying prey. After the 4th trip, Karin looked at her hands in the firelight and knew she couldn't make a 5th. The damage was too severe. Another venture into the cold might cost her fingers entirely, might turn recoverable frostbite into gangrene, might leave her crippled for the rest of her life. She counted her wood supply, 23 logs inside the cabin. At current burn rate, the elevated rate that the killing cold demanded, that was perhaps 50 hours of fire. 2 more days. If the storm lasted longer than 2 more days, she would have to choose, risk her hands or let the fire die. She wrapped her ruined fingers in clean cloth and had Ingrid tie the knots. Then she sat by the stove and watched the fire and waited for something to change. Anders was recovering. The fever had broken on the 4th night of the storm, sometime in the small hours when Karin was half dozing by the fire and Ingrid was curled in a chair with a blanket pulled to her chin. Karin had woken to the sound of her son's voice, weak, confused, but coherent for the first time in days. "Mama, I'm thirsty," she had cried then. Actually cried, tears running down her cheeks and freezing there before she could wipe them away. She had held her son and given him water and felt his forehead blessedly cool and told him he was going to be fine. Everything was going to be fine, even though the storm was still screaming outside and she had no idea if anything would ever be fine again. He was weak through the remaining days of the siege, sleeping 18 hours out of every 24, barely able to sit up without help. But he was alive. The willow bark had worked. The body heat transfer had worked. The warmth from the device had worked, keeping the cabin just warm enough that a sick child could recover instead of decline. On the 7th day, Anders walked across the cabin to look out the window. The white wall of the storm was still there, but he pressed his face to the glass anyway, peering into the nothing. "Mama, when will it stop?" Karin had no answer. She had stopped trying to predict the weather, stopped trying to calculate how much longer she could last. She simply fed the fire and watched the wood supply dwindle and waited. "Soon," she said, "it will stop soon." She had no idea if that was true. February 3rd, 1887. Karin woke to silence. For a moment, she thought she had gone deaf. The wind had been screaming for so long, 8 days, 8 endless days of constant shrieking, that its absence felt like a wound, like something vital had been cut away from the world. She lay still in her chair by the stove, listening, certain that the noise would return. It didn't. She rose slowly, her body aching from days of tension and inadequate sleep. Her hands throbbed inside their bandages. Her legs felt weak and unreliable. But she walked to the window and rubbed frost from the glass with her forearm. The world outside was white and still. The storm had broken. The sky was pale gray, a thin overcast that seemed almost bright after the darkness of the blizzard. The sun was visible as a white disk, low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snowdrifts that had reshaped the world. Nothing moved. No wind, no snow, no sound at all except the crackle of the fire behind her. She opened the door. The cold was still brutal, 30 below, maybe colder, though her thermometer was still frozen useless. But it was a different kind of cold now. Still cold, without the wind to drive it through clothing and skin. Cold that could be survived if you were careful. She stepped outside for the first time in 8 days without a rope around her waist. Her woodpile was barely visible, buried under a drift that rose higher than her head. But she could see the logs she'd pulled free during her trips, scattered in the snow where she'd dropped them. She could see the track she'd worn between door and woodpile, a shallow trench already filling with wind-blown powder. She walked to the drift and began to dig. It took 3 hours to excavate enough wood to rebuild her inside supply. Her hands were nearly useless. She had to use her forearms to push snow aside, her wrists to lever logs free, but she kept working because the alternative was not working, and not working meant dying. The sun rose higher, weak but present, and the temperature climbed from 30 below to 25 below to 20 below. Still dangerous, still potentially lethal, but warming. By early afternoon, she had 30 logs stacked inside the cabin. A week's worth of fire, maybe more if she was careful. Enough to survive until she could cut more. She stood by the stove and looked at the device mounted to her pipe. The metal had warped under the sustained heat of the siege. She could see where the tin had softened and bent, where the baffles had shifted slightly out of alignment. One of the seams showed a hairline crack, solder that had been stressed beyond its tolerance. The whole thing looked tired, used, worn by 8 days of continuous strain. But it had held. The rivets hadn't popped. The joints hadn't failed. The draft still flowed, weaker than before but functional. She ran her calculations one more time, scratching numbers on the board she'd used for record keeping throughout the winter. Without the device, she would have needed 1/3 of a cord per day during the killing cold, the elevated burn rate required to maintain survivable temperatures. That was what Silas Thornton's cabin had required, what Martha Crenshaw's cabin had required, what every cabin in Montana Territory without a heat recovery system had required. With the device, she'd burned 1/4 cord per day, maybe slightly less. That difference, 15%, perhaps 20%, was roughly 2.5 cords of wood over the 8-day siege. 2.5 cords was the distance between running out and having enough, between 18 hours of fire and 50, between crawling through the storm 4 times and crawling through it 6 times, between her children surviving and her children dying. The device was the margin. The device was everything. Karin walked to Martha Crenshaw's homestead that afternoon, 3.2 miles through snow that was waist-deep in the drifts and knee-deep everywhere else. The walking was exhausting. Each step required lifting her leg clear of the snow, planting it, compacting the powder, then dragging the other leg forward to repeat the process. She stopped every few hundred yards to rest, her breath clouding in the cold air, her damaged hands throbbing inside their bandages. It took her 2 hours, but she needed to know. She needed to know if anyone else had survived. Martha's cabin was standing. That was the first thing Karin saw, the walls intact, the roof unbowed, the stovepipe still rising from the structure. A thin thread of smoke emerged from the pipe, dissipating quickly in the cold air. The cabin was still warm. Someone was still alive inside. Karin knocked on the door with her elbow, unable to make a fist. Martha opened it. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 8 days. Her hair was wild, escaping from a braid that hadn't been redone since the storm began. Her face was hollow, cheeks sunken, eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Her hands were burned. Karin could see the marks of fire on her fingers, the blisters of someone who had reached into flames. But she was alive. Karin, Martha. They stood in the doorway, two women who had survived something that was supposed to kill them, and neither of them knew what to say. Martha stepped aside. "Come in. I need to sit down." The cabin was warm, not as warm as Karin's, but warm enough. The stove was burning, though the fire was smaller than it should have been, carefully rationed, and the furniture was wrong somehow, sparser than Karin remembered from her last visit. She looked around. The table was there, the stove, the bed frame. No, not the bed frame. The mattress was lying directly on the floor. The chairs were gone. The small cabinet that had stood by the window, the one Martha had told her about once, the one her husband Henry had built when they were first married, with hand-carved flowers on the doors, was gone. "I ran out of wood on the 6th day," Martha said. Her voice was flat, emptied of emotion, the voice of someone who had spent everything and had nothing left. "Started burning furniture on the 7th. She gestured at the empty spaces where her possessions had been. "The chairs went first. They were old anyway. We'd been meaning to replace them for years. Then the cabinet, the one Henry made." Her voice cracked slightly on his name. "I thought about not burning it. Thought about dying instead. But that seemed stupid, so I burned it." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm alive." Martha lowered herself into the cabin's only remaining seat, a rough stool that looked handmade and recent. "I built this yesterday, from a piece of the bed frame I didn't burn." She looked at Karin, at her bandaged hands, her exhausted face, the way she stood without swaying despite the obvious fatigue. "How did you make it? Your woodpile wasn't any bigger than mine. You had 2 children to keep warm. How did you not run out?" Karin told her. The device. The heat recovery. The baffles that forced the smoke to zigzag, extracting warmth that would otherwise have escaped up the chimney. The 15% reduction in wood consumption that had translated into 2.5 cords over the siege. The difference between running out on day 6 and having enough on day 8. Martha listened in silence. Her eyes went to her stovepipe, bare and blackened, heat shimmering from the tin and vanishing into the rafters. 15%, she said. Perhaps 20. I'm not certain of the exact number. 15% would have been 2 more days of furniture. Martha's voice was bitter now, angry in a way Karin hadn't heard from her before. 15% would have been Henry's cabinet. 15% would have been the chairs I sat in every morning for 19 years. I know. I told you it would burn your cabin down. You did. I told you watchin' wasn't doing. I told you a tinsmith's daughter wasn't a tinsmith. You did. Martha was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, the brief winter daylight already fading toward another long night. I was wrong, Martha said. I need you to know that. I was wrong about everything. Karin sat down on the floor beside her neighbor's stool. Her legs couldn't hold her anymore. You gave me a buck saw, she said. Without that, I wouldn't have had enough wood to test the device. I would have run out before I could prove it worked. That's not... You helped me, Martha. You helped me survive. The buck saw mattered. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched Karin's bandaged hand, gently, carefully. I need to see how you build it, she said. For next winter. I can't. Her voice broke. I can't burn Henry's furniture again. I can't watch everything he made for me go up in smoke. I'll show you tomorrow when the light is better. I'll show you everything. Silas Thornton arrived at Karin's cabin 3 days later. She heard his horse before she saw him, the crunch of hooves on packed snow, the jingle of tack. Sounds that had been absent from the world for so long They seemed almost foreign. She went to the door and watched him approach, a weathered figure on a weathered horse, moving slowly through the white landscape. He dismounted in her yard and stood for a moment looking at her cabin, at the smoke rising from her chimney, at the woodpile, half excavated now, still containing visible reserves. Mrs. Lindgren. Mr. Thornton. He tied his horse to the porch rail and climbed the steps slowly, like a man carrying a weight she couldn't see. I came to check on you, and to see your contraption. He paused. People are talking about it, saying it saved you. It helped. Helped is saved in a winter like this. She led him inside. The cabin was warm, 52 degrees, comfortable by winter standards, and the device was mounted to the stovepipe where it had been since October, blackened now with use, slightly warped but functioning. Thornton walked to the stove and examined the device in silence. His calloused fingers traced the metal, feeling the warped sections, testing the seams, examining the baffles through the gaps in the housing. He had the methodical attention of a man who understood machinery, who had spent decades working with tools and equipment, who could see the logic of a design even when he'd never encountered it before. You built this yourself? Yes. And it works? Actually captures heat? I'm standing here, aren't I? Thornton grunted. He completed his circuit of the device, then stepped back and looked at it from a distance. I lost my cattle, he said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. All of them. Found them piled against the fence line in the east pasture after the storm broke. I'm sorry. They tried to drift with the wind. Cattle do that, in a blizzard, try to walk away from the cold. But the fence stopped them, so they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, and the wind kept coming, and one by one they froze. He was quiet for a moment. Karin waited. When I found them, they were still standing. The ones in the middle of the pile, anyway. The ones on the outside had fallen over when the wind stopped holding them up, but the ones in the middle were still on their feet, frozen solid, ice in their eyes. His voice cracked on the last word. He turned away from her, facing the wall, and she saw his shoulders shake once before he steadied himself. 37 head, everything I had. Everything I'd built in 8 years of ranching. I'm sorry, Karin said again. It was inadequate, but there were no adequate words. I didn't come here for sympathy. Thornton turned back to face her. His eyes were dry, his expression controlled again. I came because I'm going to have to rebuild. New cattle, new breeding stock, new everything. And I can't do that if I'm burning half my wood supply just keeping the house warm. He looked at the device. I told you in August you should sell. I told you the math didn't work. I said you'd be dead by February, or gone by October, or burning your cabin down by Christmas. I remember. The math didn't work. He met her eyes. You changed the math. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. Karin had seen him make this gesture exactly once before, at Eric's funeral, standing by the grave, paying respects to a man he'd barely known. I'd like to build one of these, he said, for next winter, for whatever comes after this one. He paused. If you'll teach me how. The counting of the dead took weeks. The great die-up winter of 1886 to 87 killed between 50 and 90% of cattle across Montana Territory, depending on location. In some counties, the losses exceeded 95%. Herds that had numbered in the thousands reduced to dozens of survivors. Ranches that had been worth fortunes reduced to empty range and frozen carcasses. The ranching industry collapsed. Theodore Roosevelt, whose Dakota ranch had been devastated, abandoned cattle ranching permanently and returned to politics. In Custer County alone, tax rolls listed 200 ranchers in 1886 and only 120 in 1888. The rest had given up, moved away, died, or simply vanished from the records without explanation. Human deaths were harder to count. Remote homesteaders lived miles from their nearest neighbors, days from the nearest town. When they died in blizzards, no one knew for weeks or months. Their cabins stood empty through the remaining winter, snow drifting through broken windows, animals scavenging whatever food remained. In spring, when the passes opened and the snow melted, search parties would find bodies, sometimes in cabins, sometimes in fields, sometimes never at all. Official records were spotty at best. Newspapers reported what they could confirm, which was always less than the truth. In Cairns County, 11 homesteaders died during the storm, 11 confirmed deaths, out of perhaps 80 families scattered across 100,000 acres of frozen territory. She learned their names over the following weeks as word traveled from cabin to cabin across the landscape. The Petersons, a family 4 miles south. The father had gone for wood on the 5th day of the storm and never returned. His wife had waited 12 hours, then 24, then gone looking for him with a rope tied to her waist, just as Karin had done. She'd found him face down in a drift 40 feet from the woodpile. She dragged his body back to the cabin, but by then she'd been frostbitten too badly to make another trip for wood. She and her son had frozen together 2 days later, huddled in a cold cabin with their husband and father's body lying by the door. Cooper, a bachelor who lived alone in a claim shanty 3 miles north. He'd been found sitting in his chair by a cold stove, looking almost peaceful, as if he'd simply decided to stop fighting. His woodpile had been half full. He'd had enough fuel to survive, but something had broken in him, some essential will to continue, and he'd let the fire die and sat down and waited for the cold to take him. The Brennan children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, who'd caught pneumonia before the storm and hadn't been strong enough to survive the cold. Their parents had lived, barely, burning everything that would burn, keeping the cabin above freezing by sheer desperate will. But the children had been too weak, too sick, too small. They died on the same night, within hours of each other, while the storm screamed outside and their parents held them and could do nothing. Karin thought about those children often, about the mathematics that might have saved them, about the heat escaping through their chimney pipe while they lay in beds that weren't quite warm enough, fighting pneumonia with bodies that didn't have enough reserves to win. She couldn't have saved them all. She knew that. The device wasn't magic. It was just sheet metal and rivets, a slight improvement on the brutal arithmetic of frontier heating. But 15% might have been enough for the Petersons. 15% might have kept Cooper's cabin warm enough to preserve his will to fight. 15% might have given 2 sick children the margin they needed to survive their illness. Might have. Could have. If only. The words haunted her through the remainder of the winter, through the slow thaw of spring, through the long nights when she lay awake and counted the dead and wondered what would have happened if she'd shared her design earlier, if she'd taught her neighbors before the storm instead of after. Harlan Price came to see her in April. The passes had opened a week earlier, and supply wagons were finally reaching Grayling. The town was slowly coming back to life after the worst winter in its history. Merchants reopening their stores, ranchers assessing their losses, homesteaders emerging from isolation to trade news and grief. Price found Karin behind her cabin, splitting wood for the following winter. The rhythm of the work had become meditative, almost peaceful. Raise the axe, swing, split, stack, repeat. Her hands had healed enough to grip the handle, though the scars would never fully fade. Pink ridges of new skin marked where the frostbite had been worst. Mrs. Lindgren. She didn't stop splitting. Mr. Price. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the remaining snow patches. He looked at her woodpile, already building for next year, far ahead of schedule, and at the cabin that should have been empty by February and wasn't. He looked at the device still mounted to her stovepipe, visible through the window, blackened but functional. "I've been hearing about your contraption," he said. "Everyone in town is talking about it. The widow Lindgren's heat box. The thing that saved her when everyone else was burning their furniture." Karin swung the axe. The round split cleanly. 15%, Price continued. "That's what they're saying. 15% improvement in heat efficiency. Doesn't sound like much until you calculate what it means over an 8-day blizzard at 50 below. Is there something you wanted, Mr. Price?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I'm prepared to forgive the $45 debt," he said. "Your husband's debt, the one you've been carrying since May, in exchange for written instructions on the construction of your device." Karin set down her axe. She had known this moment would come. Harlan Price was a businessman above all things, and businessmen understood value, and her device had proven its value beyond any doubt. $45. Eric's debt, erased. All she had to do was write down what she knew. "No exchange," she said. Price blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I'll give you the instructions for free. The debt remains, and I'll pay it by September, as we originally agreed." He stared at her. In 19 years of doing business in Montana Territory, Harlan Price had never encountered someone who refused free money. His entire understanding of human nature was built on the assumption that people wanted to profit, wanted to gain advantage, wanted more than they had. "Why would you do that?" Karin picked up her axe again. She turned a fresh round on the splitting stump and studied the grain. "Because the device isn't mine to sell. My father taught me. His father taught him. The knowledge came to me for free, passed down through generations, kept alive because people shared it instead of hoarding it." She swung. The round split. "And 11 people in this county died this winter, Mr. Price. 3 of them were children. 2 of them froze in a cabin with a half-full woodpile outside because they couldn't get to it, because they didn't have enough inside." She looked at him. "If even one of them had known what I know, if someone had taught them before the storm instead of after, maybe they'd still be alive." She stacked the split wood on her pile. "I won't profit from that. I can't profit from that. The knowledge has to be free, or it's not worth anything at all." Price was silent for a long time. The spring sun was warm on Karin's shoulders, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the first birds returning from their winter migration, testing the air, deciding whether it was safe to come back. "I lost 3 customers to that storm," Price said finally. "Peterson, Cooper, the Brennans. People who owed me money I'll never collect. People who would have been buying from my store for another 20, 30 years if they'd survived." He looked at the folded paper in his hand. "Give me the instructions. I'll have them posted in my store, free to anyone who asks." "And the sheet metal?" "At cost. Anyone who wants to build one of these things, I'll sell them the materials at cost." He paused. "Call it the Lindgren design. Call it whatever you want, but the information goes out, and I don't charge for it." Karin studied him. This was as close to generosity as Harlan Price would ever come. Not kindness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Enlightened self-interest, perhaps. Dead customers didn't pay their debts. She took the paper from his hand. By the winter of 1887 to 88, at least 40 homesteads in Montana Territory had installed devices based on Karin's design. She taught everyone who asked. She charged nothing. When neighbors came to her cabin wanting to learn, she walked them through the construction step by step, the measurements, the baffle angles, the importance of maintaining draft, the careful sealing of seams. She showed them how to test airflow before installation, how to monitor for creosote buildup, how to know when the metal was warping and needed repair. When they asked how to repay her, she gave the same answer every time: teach someone else. The design spread hand to hand, modified with each telling. Some versions improved on her original thicker metal that resisted warping, better baffle spacing that increased heat capture, clever additions like dampers and clean-out ports that made maintenance easier. A blacksmith in Helena built a version from iron instead of tin, heavier but more durable, and it survived 3 winters without needing repair. Some versions were crude, barely functional, built by people who understood the principle but not the precision. These worked poorly, capturing only 5 or 10% of waste heat, hardly worth the effort of construction. A few were dangerous, causing exactly the chimney fires that Martha Crenshaw had predicted: creosote buildup from overcooled smoke, draft failures from poorly angled baffles, seam cracks that leaked carbon monoxide into sleeping cabins. One man died in Helena from a badly built device. The seams had failed in the night, and he'd been found in the morning, peacefully asleep, killed by the colorless gas. The Helena Independent ran a story warning about the dangers of improvised heat recovery devices, and for a few months the spread of the design slowed as people grew cautious. But the following winter was hard, and wood was scarce, and caution gave way to necessity. The devices continued to spread. Some called them heat boxes. Others called them smoke traps. A few, remembering the widow who'd built the first one, called them Lindgrens. Most called them nothing at all. They were just something you did to your stovepipe, if you knew what you were doing. A journalist from Helena visited Karin's homestead in May of 1887. He was writing a piece on what he called ingenious survival methods of the winter catastrophe, a collection of stories about settlers who'd found clever ways to outlast the blizzard. A woman who'd insulated her cabin with snow, packing it against the walls to block the wind. A man who'd survived by burning coal he'd mined from an exposed seam on his property. A family who'd sheltered their livestock inside their cabin, using the animals' body heat to keep everyone alive. And Karin Lindgren, with her metal box that made smoke work harder. She led him into her cabin, showed him the device, explained how it worked. He took notes in a small leather-bound book asking questions about baffle angles and draft pressure and heat transfer coefficients, terms she didn't know, principles she'd learned by instinct rather than education. He was particularly interested in her father, the tinsmith from Minnesota, the Swedish immigrant who'd taught his daughter a craft that women weren't supposed to know. And he learned this from his father, the journalist asked. His mother, actually, my grandmother. She grew up with a kakaloon, a Swedish tiled stove. She understood how it worked, how the smoke traveled through channels before escaping. She taught my grandfather, and he taught my father, and my father taught me. So the knowledge passed through women as well as men? In my family, yes. My grandmother said women spent more time by the fire than men did, said they had more reason to understand where the heat was going. The journalist wrote this down. Karin couldn't tell if he believed her or was simply humoring the eccentric widow with the clever stove. The article appeared in the Helena Independent 3 weeks later. It mentioned an ingenious heat recovery device mounted to the stovepipe, described as having been developed by a Swedish widow near Grayling. A Swedish widow, not a name, not a face. Just an anonymous woman, clever enough to survive, not important enough to identify. The journalist had not included the detail about her grandmother. He had not mentioned that the knowledge had been passed through women. He had not named Karin Lindgren at all. She read the article once and set it aside. She had not done what she'd done for recognition. She had done it because the alternative was death, and she had refused to die. If history wanted to forget her name, that was history's choice. Karin Lindgren proved up her claim in April of 1890, 5 years to the month after she and Eric had first broken ground. The proving up process required her to appear before the county land office with 2 witnesses who could testify to her continuous residence and improvements. Silas Thornton came. Martha Crenshaw came. They stood in the small government office and swore that yes, Karin Lindgren had lived on her claim for the required 5 years. Yes, she had built a cabin, cleared land, planted crops. Yes, she had improved the property to the government's satisfaction. The clerk stamped her paperwork, and she received her patent, 160 acres of Montana territory, free and clear, belonging to her and her heirs forever. She walked outside into the spring sunshine and stood on the wooden sidewalk of Grayling, holding the piece of paper that represented everything she'd fought for. 5 years, 2 children raised through 5 Montana winters, 1 husband buried on the northeast corner, 1 device that had changed the mathematics of survival. She had won. She planted an orchard of apple trees that summer, a dream she and Eric had discussed in their first year, an orchard that would provide fruit and shade and beauty, proof that they were building something permanent. The trees struggled in the harsh mountain climate, never quite thriving, producing small, sour apples that were better for cider than eating, but they survived, which was more than could be said for many things in Montana territory. Karin remarried in 1893. His name was Thomas Bergstrom, a widower with 3 children who needed someone to raise them. His wife had died in childbirth, the baby with her, and he'd been struggling alone for 2 years, keeping his homestead running while caring for children who needed a mother. They met at a church social in Grayling. He was quiet, practical, kind in a way that reminded her of Eric, but was entirely his own. He didn't tell her how to run her household or question her decisions about the children. He treated her as a partner, not a subordinate. When he proposed, he was honest about his reasons. "I need help," he said. "My children need a mother. I can offer you a larger homestead, more land, better prospects, but I can't offer you romance or passion or any of the things women are supposed to want." Karin had laughed. "I buried romance 5 years ago. I've had enough passion to last a lifetime. What I need is a partner who'll work beside me and not die." They married in October before the first snow. Together they raised 5 children, her 2, his 3, through 6 more Montana winters. Each winter they kept a device mounted to the stovepipe. Karin built a new one for Bergstrom's larger cabin, teaching her stepchildren the work as her father had taught her. "Metal wants to move," she told them, guiding their hands as they bent the tin over wooden forms. "You don't force it, you find where it wants to go." The children learned. Some of them had talent for metalwork, others didn't, but all of them understood the principle. The smoke should zigzag, the heat should stay inside, the device should capture what would otherwise be lost. When they grew up and married and built their own homesteads, they built devices too. And they taught their children. And the knowledge continued to spread generation to generation, an invisible inheritance that saved lives no one would ever count. Karin Lindgren Bergstrom died in 1924 at the age of 61. It was another winter death, pneumonia, the old enemy, the cold that got inside your lungs and wouldn't leave. She'd fought it for 2 weeks, propped up in bed, drinking willow bark tea like she'd given her son 38 years earlier. It wasn't enough. Some battles couldn't be won with willpower and home remedies. Some cold was too deep to survive. She died on a February morning, with her children around her bed, Ingrid, now 46, a grandmother herself, Anders, now 43, running a successful ranch, the 3 Bergstrom children who'd become as much hers as any blood relation. Her obituary in the Grayling Gazette ran 4 lines. Karin Lindgren Bergstrom, 61, died February 17th at her home. She is survived by 5 children, 12 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. She was a member of Grayling Lutheran Church for 31 years. Services will be held Saturday at 2 p.m., 4 lines. No mention of a metal box, no mention of a Swedish stove, No mention of the winter she refused to die, or the device she built with her father's tools, or the knowledge she spread freely to anyone who asked. No mention of the lives she saved, the uncountable number, the faces she never saw, the children who grew up to be grandparents because their parents had stayed warm one winter that might otherwise have killed them. 4 lines, and then silence, and then history moving on. On the morning of January 28, 1887, the mercury froze at 47 below zero. Silas Thornton had told Karin Lindgren the previous August that she would burn her cabin down by Christmas. Nobody would waste good timber digging her grave in frozen ground, he'd said. Her husband was dead, and she should take her children to Helena before the passes closed, and she should stop pretending that a widow could survive what was coming. She did not burn. She did not freeze. Her children did not become orphans in February. The device she built, riveted from her dead father's tin, soldered with her blistered hands, dismissed as grief-addled foolishness by everyone who saw it, captured enough heat to change the mathematics of survival. Not by much, perhaps 15%, perhaps on the worst days, 20%. But 15% was the distance between running out of wood and having enough to spare, between 45 degrees and 35 degrees, between a feverish child recovering and a feverish child dying, between watching her daughter feed the fire and watching her daughter feed the grave. Karin Lindgren's name does not appear in any history of frontier heating technology. The Patent Office holds no record of her design. The Helena newspaper called her simply a Swedish widow near Grayling, and even that small acknowledgement faded from memory within a decade. But somewhere in Montana, in a cabin that survived when others didn't, there was a stovepipe with a box on top of it. And inside that box, the smoke zigzagged back and forth, giving up its heat, doing its work, keeping a family alive through the worst winter anyone could remember, just like her father told her, just like in Smoland, just like it always had.